Hello and welcome to Sports in American History. We're going to start off at the very beginning of the American saga and ask the question, did early Americans play sports? And the answer is yes, they did. There's something about games and recreation that seems to be universal, at least here in North America. Here we have a picture of some early Americans playing a game that they had imported from England called cricket. We're going to see that trend a lot in early American sports. But before we start talking about European colonizers, we need to acknowledge the fact that before the Europeans showed up, this continent was already inhabited by Native Americans. So the question is, did they play sports? And the answer is yes. Native Americans love sports just like any groups that we see throughout history. Now, the sports the Native Americans did were maybe different from the ones the colonizers did, but they certainly played sports. What sports did the Native Americans participate in? Well, foot races is one of those sports you're going to find in every culture. It's such an intuitive thing to ask yourself is, can I run faster than this person? And obviously distances are variable. Some Native American peoples ran ultra marathons, and there were expert ultra marathon runners. There are the Tarahumara people of Mexico who famously competed in ultra marathons in the early 20th century and still even today. And this goes way back in their history. One of the sports the Native Americans played regularly, which has become very popular in the United States, is lacrosse. They didn't call it lacrosse, they call it bagatoué. Lacrosse is actually a French word because the French thought that their sticks that they played with looked like crosses that you would find in a Catholic church service, so the cross. Horse racing, once horses were introduced to North America by the Europeans, became important to the Native Americans. And one thing we do see is the Native Americans didn't influence the colonists in terms of sports very much. We don't see a lot of crossover between the two groups in terms of sports, which is something that we see in other groups. We're going to see a lot of crossover between Americans and British, for instance. So Native Americans absolutely did play sports. You know, it's interesting. The term sport wasn't used until about 1900. These people did not participate in sport as we think about it. It was much more recreation. It was games. But the idea of sport connotates some organization. The things they played were not organized at all. There were no professional sports in early America. Nobody made a living playing sports. There were people who made money playing sports because of gambling, but nobody was paid a salary to play a sport. There were no organized sports leagues. There were no teams that were organized and permanent. Those things just didn't exist yet. So early American sport is characterized by spontaneity. They weren't planned. Other than horse racing. Horse racing is going to be a little bit of the exception. They lack standard rules, and the contests generally didn't have referees or officials. Think about this as being like your backyard football game or playing wiffle ball, or we used to play wiffle ball on the street, and there weren't really too many standardized rules. It was all based upon, the neighborhood rules. So for me, when I was a kid, home plate was a manhole cover in the middle of the street. We had a drain on the first base side that became first base, and there was another little thing in the street that would become second base, and then a drain on the other side that was third base. And if you could hit the ball over one of the telephone wires, it was a home run. What was completely unique to where we were playing, our games weren't planned. They were spontaneous. Hey, you want to play? Yeah, let's play. It's a lot like pickup basketball in today's American sport context. Hey, you want to go shoot some baskets, or you want to go, I see kids at Normandy show up and just play some tennis. Spontaneous games, purely for fun. They lack standard rules, meaning we may play one way in this particular location, like my street wiffle ball example, but in another location, they probably play completely different. If you're playing wiffle ball in your backyard, you might say the back fence is a home run and a bush over here is first base. And it's completely based on the surroundings and the culture of the neighborhood. And of course, None of these backyard contests have officials or referees, which means that you have to call your own fouls, or you've got to determine how the rules are going to be administered, which does lead to some conflicts sometimes, but it also teaches young people how to work out differences. And so these early American sports were characterized by this spontaneity. They weren't organized. Now, one of the things we're going to see from the very beginning in American sport is a propensity to violence. American sports are violent. We like violence. We gravitate to it. And we'll ask the question, is that universal? Is that unique to the United States? Is that something that other cultures are interested in as well? But certainly in the United States, sports were violent. They were used as a platform to settle old personal grudges or larger community rivalries. So for instance, they played a game called hurling that I'll probably show you some video for. It can be a pretty violent game because it's a stick and ball game. And whenever you give somebody a stick, there's no referees, there's really no oversight. People can use those sticks as weapons. And that certainly happened. And people would settle old grudges with each other. If you didn't like somebody, man, you were going to give it to them extra. You would tee off on them, so to speak. There was nobody to stop you, other than, the fear of consequence that they might do it back to you. Or maybe there was a community rivalry that was playing out. The team from Parma is going to play a team from Seven Hills, let's say, and they have a long-standing rivalry with one another, and it might get extra, it might get, extra physical. And we see that even when sports teams are officiated. There are certain games that are just a little bit extra. So these games, it was very common for men to walk off the field bloody and broken. And that was seen as a rite of passage. If you couldn't cut that, if you couldn't withstand the violence of that game, you were seen as less than. You were ridiculed, and maybe your masculinity was even called into question. You needed to be able to hang in that situation in these communities to be considered a man, which is an interesting connection between sport and masculinity, because early American sports defined masculinity. And for them, masculinity, if you wanted to be a man, you had to be aggressive, courageous, and competitive. And all of those things could be played out on a sport field. And I'm sure I'm going to ask you some interesting questions about that going forward, but is that still the case today? So let's take a look at the game of hurling. It does not exist in the United States as far as I know, but they still play it in Ireland. And this was a game that was imported from Great Britain early on. I'm going to show you that it can be, even today, quite violent. And whenever you, like I said before, whenever you have sticks, balls, and young men, you always have the threat of violence. And you can imagine these sports got very violent. So let's take a look at that now.
That's Fergal Hegarty. Here's Dave Clark. Almost showing too much of that to Owen Markham. And in fact, fouling Markham, the referee decides. Markham is not particularly noted in Clare as a corner forward. He's moved out to the half line at this stage. Here he is, contesting with Dave Clark. And that's where the connection was made, and the referee says it was deliberate.
Shawnee Tobin was brought in as a sub for Limerick. A brief introduction. Munster hurling fair, but on the brink of half-time, proceedings ramped up a notch.
Goes to half-time, and that's a punch there, which was thrown at Donald O'Grady.
Clare down to 14 men after Pat Donlan was dismissed. If the first half...
They're working it in here. This is a dangerous moment. Lark Corbett looking for a support player. There wasn't anybody there. You saw the Kilkenny players surrounding him immediately there. The referee...
Some Kilkenny people on the way in, and they're saying, if we lose today, the other three don't count. And that's a bit drastic, but there you see Jackie Turrell, he wasn't budging. And
I think the referee's going to throw the ball in, but as you say, he wasn't going to budge there. And certainly Tipperary felt that was a foul on their man.
Yeah, it's a straight on... I suppose,
in your eyes, you go up and you bat the ball wherever. He pulls straight across Ryan O'Dwyer's head, made no attempt to play the ball. You watch it here, he just stands back and nowhere near the ball. Lets the ball straight in past him. Terrible stroke, got the red card. But this to me is a worse incident. Peter Kelly is fullback, he gets out in front of his man. You have to remember that Garrett Sinnott is playing in. He's a wing forward. He makes no attempt to go for the ball. He just hits Peter Kelly straight down top of the head, and the referee gives him a yellow card. Whatever, he must have thought there was no intent, not as much intent or whatever, careless play. But to me, the man is out in front.
Stalemate. In the end, it's Patrick Bonner-Maher, and again the referee sees the foul and gives the free in, and it hots up, and Kilkenny make it very, very awkward for Patrick Bonner-Maher. And then the referee got a little nick there as somebody was passing by, and it happened.
He did.
In the past, in other matches I could remember, and he's going to require attention. There you are, I think a stick just going by, passing him, accidentally touched the referee, and he's going to require attention. He won the free, Michael, but they were unhappy about it. I think they probably felt he had held on too long.
Yeah, he got a right clip on the nose there. I think it might have been you say Tommy Walsh, actually. It looked like Tommy Walsh has hurled through the crowd. James McGrath's gone in there now.
Well, you can see a little bit of blood coming in. Declan Fanning.
He pulled a bit of a stroke as well, yeah. Depends what the umpires say now.
Well, the umpires, this was clearly in the vision of the umpires.
2 yellows, I'd suspect.
Both
breaking out of defence there, taking it well. David Burke out of defence, out as far as Joe Canning, a crunching tackle, and it's Cody Marr who came in that time. Out over the sideline went Joe Canning, and he certainly felt the effects of that. Just have a look at this shoulder tackle again, crunching.
Yeah, I'm surprised Joe picked it, ran into the tackle. See there, no malice there, very, very hard hit.
So I'd like to end with a question that I think will reoccur as we go through this class. Do sports still define what it means to be masculine? And what are those characteristics? What does it mean to be masculine in modern society?